So thank you all. I know this is the end of the semester, and it's incredibly stressful to be trying to study for finals and get papers done, and then in addition have to, come out for a talk. So I'm triply grateful that you're here. And I will be really honest, it's this a collaborative effort that you're going to see that I present a lot of work that is really fundamentally a result of the work of many of my graduate students and my postdocs, as well as former RAs, some of whom are graduate students here, Nicole Tirado and others. So as I present, I'll try to call those out, but also just wanted to acknowledge that at the beginning. I hope to talk for about 50 minutes so that we have enough time for questions. And I hope to get a couple of things done in the talk. First, I just wanted to orient everyone to links between poverty-related adversity, children's neurocognitive function with an emphasis on executive function. How many people have heard about executive function? Great. How many people feel confident in knowing what it is that they're talking about when we talk about executive function? Okay, good. So that's actually a lot of what this talk will be about, is just to get everybody up to speed about what we mean when we say executive function and what I mean compared to what other people mean, but really to think about that in the context of exposure to adversity and the ways in which that may shape children's opportunities for learning and for their educational opportunity. And then to really think about what that means in the context of 3 different approaches to supporting low-income children's educational opportunities by trying to quote-unquote build EF. And in my view, when we think about executive function, we also want to think about emotion regulation because of increasing neuroscientific evidence and also intuitive understanding on the part of teachers that how kids regulate their emotions and how they regulate their cognitive experience of reflection are not unrelated. They're actually quite related. I hope to convince you of that as we go. And then to think a little bit about adulthood, not just executive function for little kids, not just executive function for adolescents, but also what that might look like in a 2-generation approach. And then finally, I'll try to wrap up with implications for new models of poverty, human development, and social change. So what I hope to get to, and if I rush, that's because I'm checking into time. So first, I'll just start with a figure. How many of you have gotten Dr. Reardon to run you through this model figure several million times? Have you already done this? Lots, Sean? Okay. Model of poverty rates, right? What do we see for folks who are 65 years and older, going from 1959 to now? What do we see? Thank you. A steep decline and leveling off, right? Downward slope means people are getting, old people, we're getting essentially fewer older people are poor over time, right? And what do we see for kids? This nice purple magenta line here bouncing along. Right, so decline and then an upward swing, right? So why do I show this figure? Because I really want us to think a little bit about children in poverty. And when I give talks about children in poverty, I think the tendency by not talking about poverty as something affected by social policy is that we tend to think about poverty as a natural state or as an intransigent state in which children are actually caught. And I think that that way of thinking can become reified when people like me talk about the effects of poverty on children. So I want to highlight at the beginning of this talk, and I hope to come to the end of this talk, the point that we can actually do something about poverty itself. So we can actually do anti-poverty policy. And one argument that's been made for the drop in poverty for the elderly is that that was actually engineered through social policy. So anybody know what happened around here in the 1970s? Some poverty historians have argued that the American Association of Retired Persons became an increasingly powerful lobbying body and strongly argued for larger transfers, cash transfers to the elderly, largely which were women. So widows' pensions, which were initially developed in 1935, at the same time that transfers to children, women with children, were developed as a policy lever, that was developed for widows, and that was largely for women. And what happened in the 1970s was a substantial shift in federal policy, specifically to increase those transfers so that fewer families, primarily fewer women, old women, were poor. And the reason that I point to that is just to suggest that poverty is something that we can actually do something about. Now I'm going to launch into a whole lot of evidence about what the role of poverty is in shaping children's experiences, but I want to make sure to start there, and I hope to actually end there also. So what do we think about poverty in the context of education? Dr. Reardon has been really, really persuasive in a book called With or Opportunity on the extent to which the income gap between our nation's richest and poorest kids has really substantially widened dramatically, with correspondingly large educational disparities for those kids in poverty, substantially outstripping actually the disparities that we used to think about more often in the 1960s and 70s, the race gap in terms of academic achievement. And that's really clear, for example, in data like the Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey, which highlights really the way in which kids from economically disadvantaged households come to kindergarten substantially behind, on average, their affluent and middle-income peers. And that's been found repeatedly in older studies by Lee and Burkham and in more recent analyses. Consistently in the ECLSK, we consistently see that gap to be just quite large between low-income and middle-income peers. Some analyses can make that gap smaller by putting in a bunch of other covariates that travel with poverty, but I actually don't think that's quite fair as an analysis. I can talk more about why at the end. But recently, a lot of really impressive federal and state efforts have been really marshaled to try to close that gap by really putting in a lot of educational interventions, educational experiments to try to remedy that gap, to close it, specifically focusing, for example, on math, on the Common Core, on early reading, ton on early reading, a big push for something called Success for All, for example. Lots of different school reforms that target academic achievement. But interestingly, a number of those academically oriented interventions have yielded some good evidence, but there's this new generation of interventions that have really focused on these non-cognitive skills, a term I won't ever use again, but one that focuses primarily on kids' cognitive regulation, executive function, and to some extent their socio-emotional development. And the big question is, why is that becoming so popular? What is executive function, and why do we think that that's an interesting or important way to go as we think about supporting kids' early academic achievement? So I'm going to explain what I think executive function is. In my book, executive function is three things. It's children's ability to marshal their attention. It's children's ability to use their working memory to remember what it is that they've just been taught or what they've just heard. And it's kids' abilities to inhibit a prepotent impulse, something that they feel like they're really being kind of highly driven to do, for something that's called a subordinate or subdominant expectation, which is a really complicated and very inelegant way of saying basically keeping yourself from doing what you want to do and doing what others are asking you to do, right? Which would be classically what kids would face when they were entering school in kindergarten or in preschool. And that's a tripartite kind of model of executive function that's really been established to really reside in the prefrontal cortex, in the inferior frontal gyrus, for example, big area for inhibitory control, and the dorsal medial and lateral prefrontal cortex. So I'm going to show you a way that we assess it just so that you can get your heads around it. Has anybody played the Hearts and Flowers game? Yes, of course. Jelena Overdovic has played the Hearts and Flowers game. I'm going to actually ask you all to play it. So pretend that you're playing Xbox with your cousin. Get over your sense of inhibition at using your fingers publicly for anything involving a game. So I want to see all thumbs up. Everybody have their thumbs up? Okay, good. So when it's on the left, you're going to press your left thumb. This is my left, so it's the opposite. When it's right, you're going to press your right thumb. Everybody good to go? Okay, so each time you see a heart, you're going to press your thumb on forefinger on the same side as the stimulus. For example, if the heart appears on the left, press with your left hand. Remember, press the same side as your heart. Simple, right? No problem. For incongruent, you're going to see a flower. We're going to press on the side opposite of the flower. For example, if a flower appears on the left, you're going to press with your right hand, okay? Here, you're going to inhibit on every trial the natural tendency to respond on the same side of the stimulus. Remember, press on the side opposite the flower. Ready? How you doing? Good. Took a minute, right? Now we're going to do what's called the mixed trials. Now, sometimes you're going to see a heart, and sometimes you're going to see a flower. So on only half the trials, you'll have to inhibit the tendency to press on the same side of the stimulus. But you'll have to switch between same side and opposite side. And I thank Adele Diamond for developing these amazing measures, but also for making them publicly available. So you can download this and play this all you want. The rule stays the same. For hearts, you're going to press on the same side. For flowers, you're going to press on the Right. Hearts, same side. Flowers, opposite side. Ready? Okay. How'd you do? Good. So what did you use to solve that challenge? What did a preschooler have to do? What did you have to do? You had to inhibit. You absolutely had to inhibit. What else did you have to do? Thank you. You had to remember the rule. And you had to attend, right? You had to recruit your attention to the hearts and the flowers and not to whether you were sweating and not to whether my voice is tremulous because I'm nervous and not to whether the screen is too dark on the left side. You had to really focus your attention, right? And that's why we think that those three things work so well together, because they really do comprise how you exert reflective control in a situation that has a lot of conflicting or competing demands. And again, it's basically a lot of action on this part of the brain. So why do I go through this? Because basically executive functions serve as cognitive processes that help you to select good behavioral options in the face of conflicting or emotionally upsetting demands. And what's really interesting is that the limbic part of the brain, the older, more evolutionarily older part of the brain that lives underneath the prefrontal cortex, actually is highly connected to the prefrontal cortex. And how you regulate your emotions through that limbic, older mesolimbic portion of the brain is actually really related to your cognitive processing. Why? Because we know that emotions can substantially disrupt cognitive function, right? If I am actually really stressed out and trying to get out the door with my daughter, and I'm late, and I'm trying to think about the next meeting that I have to go to, and I can't remember where my keys are, right? I know that my rising frustration with my daughter, trying to get her backpack packed and get out the door, is probably not helping me remember where my keys are. And it's probably not helping me remember calm techniques of saying, please get your backpack on, please get out the front door. It's probably leading to what I would term frazzled rather than contemplative function, right? So this idea that emotion regulation and cognitive regulation are related is actually quite an active area of research. So now we get to the role of poverty and what we know about poverty and executive function. Recently, a lot of evidence has been accumulating that socioeconomic status is associated with differences in kids' executive function on average. Specifically, that kids exposed to higher levels of poverty, exposed to higher levels of poverty-related adversity, stresses associated with poverty, show lower executive function on average over time, net of where they started out as young, very young children. So this is actually some analyses that I ran on something called the Family Life Project, where I just simply graphed kids' executive function on average among low-income families in rural and semi-rural communities across 1,292 kids. And you can see how it's such a clear dose-dependent relationship in terms of chronicity of exposure. And what's nice is not nice, but what I also found was that model was robust to thinking about it in terms of financial hardship. Families' reports of how stressful it was to make ends meet was obviously very related, in addition to just looking at families' income, to lower executive function for kids exposed to higher levels of hardship. And specifically, that was across these measures that tap attention, working memory, and inhibitory control. Lots of neuroscientific support has been increasingly marshaled to support this claim that SES disparities are associated with difficulties in terms of executive function through studies of actual brain morphology in terms of surface area and cortical thickness of key prefrontal and striatal regions. And Kim Noble, I think, was here or will be here. Will not be here, but is great and is at Columbia. Is doing really fascinating work. Krishnadas has a really nice new study out in psychosomatic medicine. This whole issue is about that and the implications of troubles with inhibitory control that might be poverty-related associated in the ways that Jelena studies through HPA axis function on the one hand and related to health outcomes on the other. It's just a lovely compendium of studies across child and adult and across clinical and developmental populations that make the case for sort of the neuroscience of SES disparities and executive function. So what's the argument here? The argument is for this toxic stress hypothesis that the stressors associated with poverty increase the wear and tear on kids and adults' cardiovascular and HPA axis, leading to higher inflammation and higher basic reactivity, which are hypothesized to be biomediators. This idea that poverty doesn't lead necessarily to terrible outcomes for kids, but when poverty has a negative or detrimental effect on kids' physiology and on kids' executive function, it leads them to be at a higher risk or higher probability of having negative outcomes and less opportunity academically. And we've written a ton about this. Me and Clancy Blair, Brick and Fisher, and Chen and Miller, 3 very different perspectives that have all reviewed that literature in case anybody wants to follow up. So it sounds very much like glass half empty, right? I was trained as a developmental psychologist to look at resilience in low-income kids. I was trained by Ed Ziegler in a context that really emphasized interventions to support low-income kids. And everything I've just said so far has been very bleak, right? That somehow poverty gets under the skin and makes kids less capable cognitively. And that is not what I want you to leave from. But rather to say cognitive neurological function in terms of cognitive regulation appears highly malleable in the context of environment, and in that way can be both negatively affected by the environment, but can also be substantially positively affected by the environment. And whether there is evidence for insult in terms of environmental insult, there's also evidence for environmental repair. Good old Samaroff and Chandler idea that you can actually help kids, support kids' brain function, neurological function, developmental function through the environment. This has now recently been written up, and it's so popular that it's highly commercialized, right? So we've talked a lot lately in the media about the lure of neuroplasticity. The rapid development in childhood of the neural substrate of EF leads to basically a huge number of products that train the brain. Anybody signed up for any of these training the brain exercises? Yes. They're kind of fun, right? It's kind of like video games that make you feel like you've taken your vitamins. It's like, why not? Well, you know, some of it is you got to be super careful, right? Because it actually has specious content in the advertisement. So in one, for example, it says, researchers at the University of Wisconsin-Madison believe new video games like Crystals of Cayder and Tenacity can measure students' learning in real time while literally rewiring kids' brains, right? Well, I don't actually have wires in my brain, so I don't know about literally rewiring my brain, but this idea that you're going to use some cheesy games to do that are concerning, right? That said, it's a huge industry. Luminosity reaches now more than 35 million people worldwide. The number of downloads is just tremendous, right? So whether you are scared by it or intrigued by it, it's coming and it's here, and it's very much a part of what we talk about. Why is it not actually the worst thing in the world? Because it turns out laboratory-based, game-like computer-based training actually has been administered to individual kids with significant attention deficit and significant working memory deficit, and those kids have gotten substantially better. They don't stay better for really long periods of time in many trials, but in some trials they do. So it suggests that it's actually somewhat promising as an area for further research and for clinical support. Clinically oriented training targeting kids with cognitive difficulty, executive function difficulties, such as kids with ADHD, has actually yielded some nice evidence by a bunch of trials by a guy named Klingberg, in case you're interested. But I think what's really more important is we have some concerns about how applicable it is for low-income kids in lots of settings where they're going to return to very chaotic classrooms or very stressful home environments that may not have the supports for their executive function after they finish that computer-based training. So instead of thinking about computer-based training where you boost the skill and then the kid goes back to the potentially very stressful environment, let's think about actually whether you could change the environment to support kids' executive function for a longer period of time. And so that's what we were really interested in testing in a big randomized cluster randomized trial called CSRP. This just basically tells you about computer-based training, which because of time I'm going to skip over, but I'm sure you'll post these slides and you can look at it. Basically shows evidence for computer-based training and why we wouldn't go that route. So what can we do in early childhood? Well, I'm really interested in thinking about testing models, developmental models, about kids' executive function and emotion regulation and this other construct called effortful control in the context of kids who are basically at home and also in preschools. In the context of poverty and anti-poverty policy on one side, and on the other, early childhood education interventions like Head Start and school choice on the other. Really trying to think about how would these models of what's going on within the family and within the early childhood care setting potentially influence kids' neurocognitive and emotional function that might improve their chances of improved school readiness when they get to school. And how can I do research that meets a sort of evidentiary base in terms of causal inference, in terms of rigor, while also trying to have some policy relevance. And so preschools in Head Start turn out to be a great place to do experiments where we can try to draw some inferences from those experiments that would inform policymakers while also really being good causal tests, good tests of those causal claims. So CSRP is an intervention that we designed in Chicago called the Chicago School Readiness Project. If anybody here from Chicago? No? Okay. So Chicago is made up of 70 neighborhoods that have a tremendous amount of poverty with a large number of Head Start eligible kids in this band around the center of the city. The lake is here, which you can't tell, but this is the super wealthy downtown area, and then there are these neighborhoods that are really, really poor, kind of in this big circular, semicircular band around the city. And so what we did was we did a block-by-block survey of 7 randomly selected of the 20 poorest neighborhoods, found all of the child care serving sites, went or called all of them, found out if they received Head Start funding, found out if they served 2 classrooms or more, found out if they were full-day classrooms, then randomly sampled from those, and then asked them if they participated in our study. And we got out of that 18 sites that were willing to participate, where we selected those neighborhoods precisely because they were experiencing basically a high amount of poverty and a high amount of crime. So we threw out communities that were experiencing lower than median levels of crime. And we consented almost all of the kids in those classrooms. And then we randomly assigned those sites to get the treatment, which was a multi-component package of supports for teachers on how to manage their classrooms more effectively so they could support children's emotional regulation and cognitive regulation versus getting a teacher's aid. Now, why in the world would I have given the control group a teacher's aid? Any thoughts? Because that's what preschool teachers would prefer, right? Actually, when you think about randomizing people to stuff, it's a good idea to think about what represents a bright contrast scientifically between what you're testing, which is, in this case, trying to improve the classroom climate to support self-regulation, and something else that would be a fair contrast. In fact, we were putting mental health consultants into the treatment classrooms, and they were there 1 day a week. And so we wanted to make sure to control for the possibility that people would say that that was just an extra pair of hands. So the teacher's aid helped to really make a bright contrast between the treatment and the control. So you knew that it was the actual content of the training and not just that extra person in the room. But it was also an opportunity to say to policymakers, look, you've got about $22,000 you could spend in this classroom. Do you want to hire another person for a part of the week? Or do you want to put a lot of time and effort and spend that money in teacher training and in implementing through a classroom consultant this very innovative but somewhat risky classroom intervention? And so by choosing a contrast that was roughly equivalent in cost, and by choosing something that teachers would actually equally prefer, we knew that when we randomized, we had a reasonable chance that sites would actually stay in the program and actually implement. And that actually happened. We didn't have any sites dropping out. So we implemented, and we got really nice effects, specifically on classroom quality, which I'm not going to show, but specifically we substantially found evidence of about a little less than a half a standard deviation change in independently measured measures of kids' executive function. Didn't get it, but it was in the right direction for effortful control. And nicely, in molar measures, these are assessor measures of kids' attention, where kids in the treatment group clearly showed higher attention and lower impulsivity relative to the control group. And then nicely, increased school readiness on language, letter naming, and math. So we found that by implementing an intervention that supported self-regulation and executive function, we got those school readiness gains, which was great in terms of making the causal inference that those quote-unquote soft skills of executive function and self-regulation matter for learning. So the next question was, would these findings basically be maintained, would kids actually carry those skills into kindergarten? Were we actually able to make any headway on closing the achievement gap, so to say, by the time kids were in kindergarten? And what we found in the short version is that that was only true for kids who were going to higher quality kindergartens, because we couldn't randomly assign kids to a whole different next intervention. Kids non-randomly selected into a huge number of kindergartens scattered all over the city. So remember, I was in 18 sites in 7 neighborhoods. This is the number of kindergarten sites that kids went to after leaving our intervention. And Nicole and others were instrumental in graphing where kids went. And just to see that kids went from 18 sites to over 150 kindergartens was very humbling in terms of thinking about mobility and migration and how we don't, as researchers, get to control kids' experienced lived worlds. They non-randomly sort into their worlds after they leave our experiments. So what's the fair representation or fair expectation that we should have of intervention in the context of long-term exposure to poverty-related adversity? What are my kids, my CSRP kids, experiencing? Well, they continue to experience potentially chronic exposure to family-level poverty and to neighborhood crime, and I'll show you why I'm focusing on crime in a minute. We did dose them with experimental change in preschool, but they are then entering non-experimentally and sometimes quite teratogenic, I think, negative quality in kindergarten. Kids were going into much larger class sizes from about 17 to 20 kids into class sizes of about 28 kids, huge class sizes that were often extremely disorganized. And they continued to go to different schools that varied dramatically in their school quality. So we argued, how are we necessarily expecting our preschool intervention to work to inoculate kids? That might actually be an unfair expectation. It's like taking the foot off the brake, essentially, which Sean has heard me say, but I'll say it again. So the next step that we really wanted to pursue was to really think about this in terms of what we know as developmental psychologists, to really take a longitudinal approach to thinking about growth and change over time. And to leave aside for a minute the concerns about causal inference in the sense that we knew that we couldn't re-randomize. We couldn't use experimental methods to try to get at this question. We could address causal concerns by saying, well, look, we know where kids were in preschool. So if you think that there are a whole bunch of quote-unquote omitted variables, unmeasured variables that are really driving this story, we at least know if they're time invariant, if they don't change over time. When we put kids' baseline performance in, their kindergarten or their preschool performance into models, at least that should take care of all the family factors that don't change over time. So if moms are really poor decision makers or dads have really major problems with alcoholism, if we put in, and that affects kids' pre-K performance, and it affects their 5th grade performance, at least if we put their pre-K performance in, even though we haven't measured those parental characteristics, that should serve as a reasonably rough proxy, so that even though we can't draw causal inferences from these longitudinal models, they're conservatively estimated. Is everybody clear what I just said? So it's not a solution, but it's part of the way there, right? In the world of longitudinal analysis, I think we undervalue what those models are actually doing. They're actually quite conservatively estimated because we are basically saying when we put in early childhood baseline performance of kids, we're capturing a lot of the variance that we think might be some of the confounds that lead to us making or being at risk of making the wrong inferences. We're actually quite conservatively estimating what the role of the environment is, because surely the environment influenced the first 4 years. By putting in that first baseline set of variables, we're taking care of that somewhat statistically, if you think that time invariant characteristics are a driving force in kids' lives. Okay, so with that story in mind, how do we think about poverty? So we're working a lot right now on trying to characterize poverty-related risk, and the ways that we're thinking about it are really in terms of type. So are kids exposed to low income, income to needs ratios below 0.5? What's the income to needs threshold of 1? Who wants to shout out what poverty threshold is? Just say 3 for the sake of argument. 22 grand, right? So 22 grand is, hardly any money. So graduate students trying to make it on 22,000 are really definitely challenged in terms of covering rent. Just imagine clothing, utilities, transportation, everything, right? A lot to try to make on $22,000. So half of $22,000 is $11,000. So families living on $11,000 are living in what we would clearly term deep poverty, right? Lots of issues about definitions, but surely that should be definitely in the metric of a type of disadvantage or stress that a family is experiencing. Life stressors, the events that might happen that are more frequent when you are facing trying to make ends meet, like crowding, like being stuck with housing that has mold on the ceilings, or family members who don't have access to adequate health care. Low levels of neighborhood safety and high crime, so being not income insufficient means that you're often stuck in situations you can't get out of, like being able to move if your neighborhood's unsafe. And we look at that a bunch of different ways through self-report, but also Nicole and others in our lab have been doing a tremendous job of actually geocoding crimes and seeing how proximal kids in our sample are to those crimes. And then being basically unable to leave a school that's really poor performing, or not knowing about how to leave a school that's poorly performing. And in Chicago, there's such heterogeneity in school performance that that's actually something we can model quite well. So those are the types of stressors that we think come with poverty. And just to give you a descriptive snapshot of our sample, when we follow our kids from age 4 to 11, we see that about a third of our sample is exposed to between 5 and 7 types of risks. A lot of risks, right? Many of us would report 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of those risks, but 5 to 7 of them is a lot. So when you think about that sort of epidemiology or the population level of risk, this is non-trivial exposure to stress. Timing, does it happen early or late in kids' childhood? And there's a lot of reason to think that when it occurs early, it might be more negative for kids' outcomes because of the rapid growth in executive function and brain development in early childhood. In infancy also. And then turbulence versus chronicity. Is this something that families are moving in and out of poverty a lot? Or are they really poor all the time? Or are they actually just above the poverty line? And so just to give you an example, this is some really nice work done by a master's student, by Stephanie Jones, this master's student, Melissa Seliger-Schamberg. And so she just plotted the proportion of kids who never were actually in deep poverty, or actually income to needs at 1, from the time of the initial start of the study all the way to the end, compared to kids who were in poverty all times, which was only 5%, right? So chronicity of poverty is actually really important for us to think about. How many years is a family really struggling to scrape by, or is there a lot of mobility out, in and out? Financial assets. So this is the number of families that have some savings. 13% have some savings. These are the families that have some savings only some of the time, and these are the families that have no savings. Okay, so how do we then think about kids' executive function and emotion regulation? This was an opportunity that we had that was funded by NIH to go back and collect more data when children were in 5th grade. So we knew these kids when they were 4, and now we get a chance to see them again when they were 11. Super exciting. The data collection demands and challenges of this were tremendous, and we capitalized on a group of data collectors that were actually retired school personnel from Chicago Public Schools. So we leveraged the talent in the workforce in the school system and said, if we could pay you, would you guys take laptops into schools, find our 600 kids, and assess these kids, after we hired a separate contractor to actually relocate and reconsent our kids. And we were able to do that for about 400 of our kids. Before we did that, obviously, each of those data points is extremely expensive. So what we did was we piloted our measures to make sure that our measures worked for low-income ethnic minority kids at this age range. And so what Nicole and I and a bunch of other people did was we ran a little mini camp, sort of a fake camp that we attached onto a local community-based organization in New York, where we provided them with some activities and some curriculum that Nicole worked really hard to develop, either yoga or in sort of mindfulness, or an adventure outdoor camp, thinking maybe being outdoors supports executive function, or maybe yoga does. We didn't really have our bets placed on either of those. We just wanted to give back to the community agency, basically, and randomize. But really, we were using that tremendously to try to norm and standardize and pilot a lot of measures of executive function and emotion regulation. And so we use this thing called the DOT probe, which I'll show you a lot more about whether kids could identify different emotions being shown by 1950s faces, these standard faces that were come from this thing called the Florida Affective Battery, and how much they actually reported subjective feelings of distress. And then we used these cognitive measures of executive function, something called Iowa Gambling Task. I don't know if anybody's played this, but you basically see whether you can learn to pick from decks that don't end up taking your money, but instead actually reward you. Hearts and Flowers, which I just showed you, and Color Stroop, which is just basically another cognitive stop signal go, no-go task. We were particularly interested in and concerned about crime. The reason that we were particularly interested and concerned about that was because we had this wonderful colleague, Pat Sharkey, had just come out with this great paper where he modeled kids' proximity to crime and showed that when kids had a homicide or a very negative crime occurring close to kids' homes, you could see clearly, causally, an impact on their test scores. And I went up to Pat and said, I think I know the mechanism for that. I think that it's kids' executive function that's being negatively impacted. And he said, really? That's pretty cool. I don't have the time to geocode the data. I said, well, neither do I. And Nicole said, but I do. And so Nicole, genius that she was, went ahead and geocoded all of the schools and all of the homes for our kids across 2 years of data. It was an insane amount of data collection. And with that, we were able to do what's called kid fixed effects models to show that when crimes were very proximal to kids' homes and occurred within a very short time period, that we could see clear evidence of it having an iatrogenic effect on kids' attention and kids' impulse control. It was really impressive to see that in the CSRP data. So the next question was, would we see that again when we went back to look at kids in 5th grade? So we used a task called the DOT probe, which I'm going to just run through quickly. And basically, it's just to look at kids' ability to deploy their attention. Remember, I told you that executive function really is reliant on attention. Turns out emotion regulation is really reliant on attention, too. If your parents are arguing in the next room, the question is, can you keep focusing on the thing you're doing, or is your attention diverted to that argument? If people are arguing next to you, is it easy or hard for you to attend to that or away from that? And it turns out that if you're in the context of high threat, it can really disrupt your attention and really, really affect or modulate or modify how you can regulate your emotion. Or at least that's theoretically what's going on in terms of the neuroscience of emotion regulation. So we really wanted to look at attention to threat. So what we did was we showed kids a little cross in the middle of the screen. We showed them 2 totally neutral things. Hopefully nobody finds a white porch table or a Scotch tape roll threatening. We showed them a dot, and we said just push the key on the left or the right depending on where you see the dot. So that's called a neutral trial. Here's a positive trial. So somebody said that it looks like a bunny ripping another bunny's head off. That's not what it is. It's just a bunny next to another bunny. It's supposed to be positive. That's a positive congruent trial, and many people see the dot a little bit more quickly and can push the button a little bit more quickly because their attention is drawn to this positive stimulus. So it's called facilitation. And you can imagine it might be harder to disengage from the bunny and put your vision, your attention all the way over here, and that would be called disengagement. So we look at facilitation and disengagement. Now, we also flash negative stimuli, like this gun. And you can imagine that if you're exposed to a lot of violent events or threatening events, your attention might be drawn more to, or actually less to, very negative stimuli. In which case, this could either facilitate or disrupt your attention. And that's what we were really interested in knowing. So that's a negative congruent, and that's a negative incongruent. And we compare your reaction times to those stimuli to understand whether your exposure to violence in your community is associated with your ability to deploy your attention. Everybody clear? What have we learned through these follow-ups? Well, first of all, really quite depressing evidence that CSRP initially, preschool intervention, did not have a long-term impact on kids' executive function or their emotion regulation or their academic outcomes by 3rd grade. And we're analyzing now by 5th grade, and we have some actually very cool findings that I won't talk about, but that suggest that there actually is some reason to think that there may be what's called sleeper effects, that sometimes we have evidence where we don't see academic gain or benefit of intervention in middle childhood, but as kids enter adolescence where they actually have more autonomy and more choice, there may be evidence of them making better choices or worse choices based on early intervention, specifically drawing on some great work by Raj Chetty and others that really argue for why we might see sleeper effects. Terry Moffat also. But anyway, we can talk about that more later if we have time. What we have found is really clear evidence of the type of adversity mattering. So exposure to violence is turning out to be a major factor in our analyses in terms of the lives of our kids in CSRP. It's clearly having negative sequelae for their ability to process and respond to emotionally threatening stimuli. Or at least I can't come up with an argument that isn't causal for why kids who are disproportionately exposed to violence are also showing differences in their ability to attend to these emotionally negative stimuli. We could make an argument about some selection characteristic that leads them to have disrupted attention, that also leads them into more unsafe neighborhoods, but I don't find those arguments particularly compelling. So right now I'm willing to believe these evidence that suggests that higher acute exposure within 2 weeks predicts difficulties within disengagement from negative stimuli using radial fixed effects, so where kids are actually compared to themselves at different time points based on or other kids in their same exact neighborhood, depending on when their exposures were to those violent crimes. And then cumulatively, higher exposure to neighborhood crime over prior years significantly predictive of higher negative facilitation on the DOT probe. And interestingly, less appraisal of fear in faces. Kids have harder times in terms of modulating their attention faced with negative stimuli, and also harder time identifying others' emotions, particularly the emotion of fear. And that's just suggesting that there are significant disruptions in how kids modulate and regulate emotion that may have significant implications for how they process emotional information. Yes?
So,
thank you so much, Michael, for jumping in, because I love being interrupted, and I forgot to say that.
I'm Michael Wald. So in some other work that I'm doing right now, I didn't bring the table. Starting in 1994 to 2013, I would estimate that kids are exposed to 70% less violence now than in 1994, including child abuse and neglect, violent crime in their neighborhoods, and domestic violence within their households. How would you imagine that showing up in better outcomes for kids, assuming those numbers are correct?
Such a totally great thought, right? If there's massive differences in cohort exposures, that would mean that the mothers of my kids were much more highly exposed than my kids are, right?
Right.
So that would mean that if my kids are showing iatrogenic effects of violence, they might be more readily showing iatrogenic effects through parenting of the exposures their mothers had than they might directly of their own exposures, right? I mean, if you were going to posit that violence has negative sequelae, we would then argue that they're probably likely to be showing indirect effects of their mother's exposures more than direct effects of their own exposures, which would be a very cool thing to test. So other people in a consortium of folk that I'm part of are much more focused on the childhood exposures of the adults in the families that we're studying. And I tend to discount that because I feel like that was then, this is now. I can just study what I can control. I can't really control kids' exposures now, but at least I can measure it. But that's a really interesting point, that this may be on the lower end of the exposures estimate, given if you believe that chronic exposures have sequelae and the sheer volume of exposures was higher, then I may be misestimating exposures by looking at kids rather than looking at family exposures.
And to follow that, in some ways, Sharkey argues in his book that there's generational differences.
He does.
It might be earlier generations show it.
He does.
In a different way.
That's absolutely right. And I kind of think more about his current work looking at acute exposures that he can document so beautifully using really nice fixed effects models that I'm drawn to methodologically when I'm not actually thinking conceptually about what it means intergenerationally for kids to be with parents who, if they were in the same neighborhoods and exposed cumulatively from their own childhoods. That's a really interesting point. Other thoughts, Peggy? Yeah, no, it's a really good point. So on the TV side, no, I didn't. It's a really good question, but the issues around causal inference and TV exposure are so intense that I just decided to leave it alone because, you know, kids who are more disruptive tend to like more violent shows, blah, blah, blah. So I just knew not going there today. But important question. On the second point, so this work was done primarily by a fantastic grad student who just finished her PhD and is now at Harvard as a postdoc, Dana McCoy, and she's co-authoring with Amanda Roy, who's next going to put cell phones with kids where she can geocode kids' actual movements through their communities and get kids to report using EMA, momentary assessments, and looking at matching those data with crime data to actually see how much kids select into and out of risky situations, into and out of exposures, so that we have a much better estimate of kids' exposures. Because frankly, this was off of a very gross proxy, not to in any way slight what Nicole and Pat and I were all doing, but frankly, kids are no longer necessarily near their homes by the time they're in 7th and 8th grade. So as kids get older, we want to be able to capture where kids really are and how much kids are mobile and how much their paths cross with danger as well as safety to understand how kids navigate their environments, but also how exposed they are. So the question about intergenerational exposures are fascinating, and we really have no grip on that. It's very costly to get the kid data, and we can barely get any from the parents, but it would be nice to know the next round if I could capture that. It's a great idea. And then lastly, just looking at chronicity, children who spend more years below the poverty threshold have lower teacher-rated executive function in 3rd grade, net of initial poverty level, and net of initial EF skills in preschool. And as I mentioned about inclusion at baseline, I feel pretty good about those findings. It just came out last year. And we're finding consistently that this chronicity of poverty factor is real in our analyses. As an example, I just thought I'd show you some risk-taking behavior data. Kids are, as they get older, also prone to taking more risks. That has really interesting behavioral health and mental health implications. Specifically, adolescents who are prone to greater risk-taking, we know, have difficulty in attending to and remembering the costs of risky decision-making, right? It just doesn't penetrate when my child says, I really want to skateboard down that railing, that when she's thinking about that, she doesn't actually remember that there may be really bad things that happen when you do that. She's only essentially incentivized by the thrill factor. The sort of sensitivity to reward is heightened in adolescence, and the recall of the consequences is lower. And so we call that reward sensitivity, and it sort of lays right between executive function and emotion regulation. It actually pulls on both. Kids with lower EF report higher levels of impulsivity and higher rates of alcohol-related problems, cigarette use, illicit drug use, et cetera. So executive function clearly has a lot of health implication in terms of helping kids to avoid risk-taking behavior or conversely not protect them from that. So we've been looking at that specifically among adolescents in our sample, well, pre-adolescents in 5th grade, using this Iowa gambling task. And what we find is that kids don't really get this game yet. They're too young yet to really get how to play the game, so they lose over time. They start with $200, and sure enough, they don't get $400 by the end of the game. They get zero. As they play the card game, basically, they keep picking these high-risk portions of the deck that end up actually costing them. And what we find is that kids tend not to really register that these high payout decks, you get hit with a loss very infrequently. And so they think that's the better deck to pick. But in fact, when they get hit with a loss, they get hit with a very big loss, like all $200 gets taken in one fell swoop. And so they're not really sensitive to that portion of the deck, of how to avoid those infrequent high losses. And what we find is that the chronicity of poverty is really clearly associated with their risk-taking behavior on self-reports for kids who aren't able to really distinguish those high-risk losses yet. So those kids who are having trouble with that reward sensitivity, with that executive function, who are exposed to much more chronic exposure to poverty, are the ones that are at higher risk in terms of risk-taking behavior. So this way in which the environment is placing them at disadvantage or at least associated with greater risk is really compelling to us and really important. And this just shows, again, similarly, that kids with higher executive function are actually in better shape. So being able to remember, being able to pay attention, and being able to exert inhibitory control and not be quite as impulsive means that kids are essentially doing better, even though they may be less sensitive to these rewards in terms of their risk-taking. And that has significant implications for thinking about interventions. So when we think about interventions for adolescents, we say, let's roll out some major, don't take drugs kind of curriculum, or safe sex curriculum that's very cognitively demanding and cognitively oriented, right? It's about learning the information about birth control, or learning the information about avoiding risky circumstances. But actually, thinking about executive function and inhibitory control training might be really effective. And has been recently used with adolescents to actually shift kids' executive function in short term in terms of their inhibitory control. Some other colleagues are doing some really interesting work with mindfulness, trying to support executive function through that kind of domain. And the third that I'll just mention is PTSD treatment. And the reason that I'm interested in considering PTSD treatment is because I just saw these amazing data from a colleague named Kirsten Keenan, who's working on PTSD in both the military and urban communities. And she noted that her sample, who are mostly working class women and men in Ohio from inner cities, were reporting really high PTSD before they had been deployed. She's like, what's with that? I've got high symptoms of PTSD, but they haven't actually been in war. What's going on? So she collected the same items from folks in inner city Detroit and in the Ohio National Guard after deployment. And I just want you to take a look at some of those numbers. Right? So the number of folks who report being shot or stabbed is quite intense. The number reporting being mugged, badly beaten, or threatened with a weapon, also very intense. These are self-report. We always have, worries about self-report, but the sheer epidemiological kind of reality of exposures for folks in concentrated poverty in inner cities, I think, has been pretty dramatically underestimated by people like me. So that when we think about mental health sequelae, we're thinking more and more about how our kids are not protected from this, but are actually at risk of internalizing. And so that's what I've actually applied to do in the next round of data collection. If we're funded, we'll be looking at internalizing anxiety, worry, withdrawal among our kids as a risk factor in their risk-taking behavior, arguing that kids with a higher probability or risk of internalizing or anxiety and depression are at risk for having executive function difficulty, emotion regulation difficulty, and that might be a real key mechanism for what may be placing them at risk. So just to wrap up, the last thing I'll just mention is the intervention that specifically targets young adults with their role as parents, particularly among a low-income Latina sample, almost all recently immigrated and undocumented in New York City. We were funded by Administration for Children and Families to do a parenting intervention to target or to address the question of toxic stress. So now we're really looking at parenting and parent and child, both the adult and the kid. We're looking at executive function and emotion regulation and also stress physiology in both the parent and the kid, and thinking in the context of kids going to school, but also, again, in the context of home visiting and anti-poverty. The two aims really that we're focusing primarily are just to find evidence, if there is evidence of the biobehavioral cost of toxic stress to low-income toddlers and their mothers who are exposed to higher levels of poverty-related stress. And specifically, we expect higher poverty-related stress to be predictive of disruptions in stress physiology and disruptions in early emotion and attention regulation for both moms and kids, which I think is really important for us to highlight. And then does an intervention that's a 14-session intervention implemented in the home through what's called video feedback, where we actually show moms a video clip of another mom doing what we're kind of hoping for in terms of reading her baby's signals or being more emotionally responsive and more well-regulated, essentially, or talking more to her baby and doing early reading activities. Whether when we show moms those video clips and then we videotape moms themselves, and then we show the moms those videotapes of themselves doing those activities, and we give them a lot of feedback. And this is implemented by paraprofessionals with about an associate's degree level of training. It's relatively expensive, but not incredibly expensive to implement. And it's just a different model of how to do a parenting home visiting intervention or curriculum in the home. What this allows us to do, if we can see any evidence of this intervention working, is we're looking for evidence of repair for both stress reactivity and neurocognitive function for both moms and kids. And this experimental design would allow us to make these stronger causal inferences regarding these biobehavioral mechanisms that I've been talking about. And we have some implications for how to think about how to direct early Head Start on innovative practices that might yield significant benefit for families. Right now we've had about 120 families enrolled, and we're going for 180, so we have one more year to go. And this is primarily in the Bronx and in Queens, with a little bit of recruitment in East Harlem and in Lower Manhattan. Two-stage random assignment. So I was adamant that we assigned home visitors to treatment and control, which turns out to be kind of a huge challenge if anybody's interested. I would never do this again. And then we randomly assign families to home visitors so that we're controlling for all kinds of things in terms of design, sort of like insurance. And families are getting about between 8 and 14, but generally about 12 90-minute visits using this wonderful curriculum by Susan Landry, if anybody's interested. And so I mentioned this video feedback approach. This is us training our home visitors. That's a home visitor, and this is our clinical consultant. This is our trainer, Ursula from Texas, from Susan Landry's team. She's fantastic, and she's training a home visitor here. This is a family that we just pulled in from our, we have like a demonstration recruitment sample that we use a lot to learn more about parenting and parent-child interaction and to train. So this is the the trainer coaching the home visitor on how to deliver the intervention. Yeah, so we randomly assign home visitors to treatment, which is using this PALS intervention, and they receive weekly supervision from our clinical supervisor, and they lug around a video camera and a laptop, and they have to give us a lot of information about how the visit went, and they have a lot of opportunity for a lot of professional development. So it involves some technological sophistication because they have to use all this technology. It involves some time management and organizational skill, and it involves being really connected to their own development as paraprofessionals entering the field. And what we find is that our agency directors see that and are totally mesmerized by it and realize that the home visitors in the control condition are not doing hardly anything relative to all the things that the treatment home visitors are doing. And so the control home visitors get really upset. The treatment home visitors, some of them love it and some of them can't stand it. and don't like that they're being held to much higher standards of work performance. And we find that our home visitors are quietly controlling how families are enrolled by going basically to the family coordinators and saying, I really don't want a caseload of 12 PALS families. Please send those families elsewhere. And we go in and we say, randomization has to happen. Here are some envelopes. You have to use these envelopes. They're randomly assigning families to treatment and control. And lo and behold, we get completely unequal cell sizes with families that, you know, I mean, I'm like going insane. Right? So what I'm learning is if you do it, you have to do it agency-wide. You have to randomly assign at the cluster, at the unit level. And I thought that, stupid me, I thought that because you can, turns out you can randomize classroom teachers to treatment and control within schools, I thought we could randomly assign home visitors within an agency. And I was dead wrong. So the home visitors are randomly assigned, which means I can faithfully leave my RCT knowing that if I find any differences, it's not because really high-quality home visitors were self-selecting into the treatment, which other RCTs can't say, but I have people actively unzipping my RCT for every time I re-zip it. So it's just a design challenge that I hope you all solve. What we're finding for the candidate mechanisms that accompany poverty for this sample is a high level of psychological stress associated with crowding, instability, and turbulence. These families are doubled up and moving all the time, which makes it very hard to get our post-test data. But it's also important for me to understand in terms of what low-income families are facing, immigrant families are facing in New York as of 2014. We're finding high levels of fear and anxiety reported by these moms associated with legal and physical vulnerability, associated with their undocumented status. We're not able to capture that directly, but luckily, Hiro Yoshikawa is a wonderful colleague and has taught me a lot about undocumented immigrant status and parenting and what that looks like in New York, and we're becoming increasingly alert to it. We're finding out a lot about violence and conflict within the household, and of course, we're finding increasingly more about violence and conflict in the neighborhood. And what we're particularly interested in is the interplay between emotion regulation and executive function, both for the maternal and toddler members of the dyad, and how much malleability there is for that, and how much families are actually highly motivated to learn a lot about parenting and to learn how to parent well in the context of this new community, this new set of cultural demands, this new school setting. The parents are actually very motivated in this intervention, and I'm very hopeful in that regard. Just so you see what we're recently doing, I've just started analyzing the first 120 cases just to see if the measures are working. And so one of the ways that I looked at that was to look at 3 stressors, interparental violence, parenting hassles, and infant reactivity or toddler reactivity to see whether the executive function measure and the emotion regulation measures are sensitive to the variability in those samples. So I'm not saying in any way that there's anything causing anything here. I'm just interested in seeing if the data are hanging together in ways that would be sensible. So the very first thing that I was doing was just looking for the variance on domestic violence risk and using these Strauss items, you know, like my partner or I threatened to hit or throw something. And I was very surprised to find much higher rates than have been reported in my previous samples. So this is a small sample, and I don't know how much more I'm going to find, but usually I have a humongous amount of families reporting nothing and a few families reporting like this much. But I'm actually getting a little bit more of a variance than I anticipated. And what's really remarkable was that for today's talk, I just ran these regressions just to see. And you can see that the dot probe in terms of families' moms' ability to marshal their attention in the context of those negative stimuli are quite clearly associated with how much they feel hassled by parenting challenges in terms of their stressors as parents, but also, interestingly, marginally by how much their infants or their toddlers are independently coded as highly emotionally negatively reactive. And then for executive function, domestic violence risk is actually clearly significantly associated with slower response on the mixed trials of executive function, the hearts and flowers, which is not in any way anything other than intriguing and suggestive that we're traveling down the right path. So implications for poverty research, just to wrap up, we really feel that neurocognitive functions like emotion regulation and executive functions serve as excellent candidate mechanisms or levers, both to understand the costs of poverty to kids' development and adults' development, frankly, but also to think about those levers as opportunities for repair, opportunities to support kids and adults in the context of poverty and income inequality. We're really particularly interested in understanding better, with more precision, what we mean by adversity. So Yelena knows this very well. When we look at the literature on adversity, some people just use SES. Other people look at whether the parent reports ever having had anything bad happening in their lifetime early. Others look at whether there was crime. There's very, very, very mixed bag in terms of measurement, and I think sometimes we get equivocal findings, mixed findings, because we're not particularly precise, many of us as developmentalists, about what we mean by adversity. So I really want us to shape that up and understand what we mean by measuring it more effectively. And then thinking about implementing remedies to support positive outcomes across different developmental epochs. So I am now sold on not just saying early childhood only. You know, I will not be in the camp that says pre-K is going to solve it, because my pre-K intervention didn't. And I'm sanguine now and think that actually you have to think more across a developmental set of epochs in early childhood, in adolescence, and in early adulthood, even though that's a very expensive thing to think about. And then to think really about attention to multiple neuropsychological mechanisms, inhibitory and control and working memory, fear and anxiety in the context of threat, and sensitivity to reward and assessment of risk are the three dimensions I'm particularly interested in, because I think they work together nicely in explaining both adolescent and adult functioning, both in the context of behavioral health and in parenting, for example. I think that fear, anxiety in the context of threat is going to have a lot to do with how mothers actually end up responding to their own baby's negative emotion. I'm particularly interested in that as a next question to start pursuing as I look at how to support young parents and in supporting their own children's emotion regulation. So building ER and EF. Sure, Michael. Yeah, because I'm pretty much done.
Okay. So a lot of reports for the population that you're studying will report at least 25% prevalence rates of depression, clinical depression. What's the interaction of depression with fear and these other type of factors you're focusing on?
Yeah, so the question in terms of the interaction of depression with these mechanisms is a really good way to pose it. Many studies in the neuroscience sort of dimension of the research really treats anxiety and depression, well, treats anxiety as a trait-based dispositional characteristic that moderates. It really does serve as an interaction in statistical terms for mothers' executive function, for example, and for their responsiveness actually to infant cries, where how moms respond is actually quite predictable for non-depressed moms, but for depressed moms looks really, really disrupted, right? Or for anxious moms, for example. A different literature, a clinical literature in depression, really thinks about how exposures to adversity predispose individuals, particularly adult women, to higher depressive symptoms, that then higher depressive symptoms actually predispose those adults to difficulties in interpreting and responding to emotional situations, particularly in being more attentive to the negative features of emotional stimuli in relationships and in situations, this sort of idea of being rejection sensitive or emotionally more glued to negative stimuli, and less able to pick up on positive stimuli. And this idea that depression, which can be adversity sort of triggered, can actually be self-reinforcing. So that if you have an early bout of depressive symptoms, it makes it much more difficult to avoid a later bout because of changes in emotion regulation and neurocognitive function, which has really intense implications for models of poverty and depression, right? Because we know that folks who are depressed have a harder time getting and keeping a job. They have a harder time pursuing educational outcomes post-high school, et cetera, right? So you can imagine these ways in which early economic setback might really predispose folks cognitively to having difficulty processing a lot of information that would then set them on a trajectory that would make it harder to get out of that economic setback. And that's starting to be understood better at sort of neurocognitive levels and emotional regulatory levels. How that plays with low-income moms is just starting. It's like really brand new. So we're really interested in this among depressed moms, but we're also interested in it as a predisposing factor that may increase risk of depression. And once depression is triggered, whether that predisposes risk to not being able to get out later on.
So I was reading the Scarcity book by Eldar Shafir and Sandil Oldmanian, and so I was thinking about the difference between their frame on some of this. Like, so their frame of poverty is that poverty is about scarcity. Scarcity has a kind of bandwidth-reducing effect on cognitive functioning. Your frame is sort of that poverty is problematic, particularly because it leads to adversity, and adversity is linked to kind of not just cognitive function, but emotional features too. And I'm trying to think about whether or not, what the trade-off in thinking about those sort of two different frames or different ways of thinking about these types of problems.
Yeah, so I haven't read Scarcity, but I've been facing this a lot, which is the notion of what's the time course of the effects of poverty-related adversity. So you can think of the transient time course, like minutes, days, and hours, right? So like, or minutes, hours, and days, I guess. So what's the, acute attention diminishing effect of a lot of cognitively demanding and conflicting or depleting environmental constraints? And then what are the longer time course effects? If the chronicity, if that occurs, if there's wear and tear on the HPA axis, and that's, basically affecting, a whole lot of neurocognitive development over time, how does that look over months or years? And I think, I haven't read Scarcity, and I need to, but I wonder how much they're using that latter lens, because it sounds like they're really thinking more from the former lens, that the day-to-day of the depleting aspects of scarcity is what they're really talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. Theirs is a very, when you're under conditions of scarcity, you perform badly because of the attention-grabbing demands.
Right.
But when the scarcity goes away because you got your paycheck, or the rains came and now your crop is in and everything's better, then you do fine. Like, they don't have a chronic model from what I can tell. So maybe that's really.
So cash transfer experiments would solve that, right? Because you would then be able to say, okay, you've been poor for 5 years, but now we're going to give you 8 months of income security. And do things get better in the first 4 weeks? Do they get better in the next 4 weeks, right? We could, Yelena could collect hair court, and we could look at your HPA axis, cortisol production month by month to see what the role of anti-poverty effort might be.
The work you're talking about is with adults.
It is with adults, but not with kids.
Which is a very different developmental trajectory. What Cybele is talking about has a developmental sequelae back behind it, because the stressors she's talking have a cumulative effect on the growing neurocognitive development, which may not be as plastic.
Right. I mean, we're talking cortical thickness, right? Like, we're talking anatomical, which is not.
Not going to be on a monthly basis, like the same way.
But it's a great point. Right. So. Oh, sorry. The question is, so, how does it work? Would you see remediation of quote unquote insult with a short-term burst of income support? And maybe you would in adults on a lab task, or on a task that's not actually super generalizable. But you might not in kids in these sort of more broadband generalizable tasks, because maybe that's actually drawing on features of brain development that don't remedy in weeks, they remedy over years. So the question of what's going on developmentally is actually important. So I guess I just want to end with where we go with policies. Obviously, educational reform targeting curriculum and teaching and building ER and EF are areas that I really strongly endorse, given the evidence that I think kids' executive function does causally matter for learning, and poverty puts executive function at risk. So giving educational supplement or support to build kids' EF in those contexts seems eminently sensible. I think we only partially are going to meet our targets when we focus on remedying exposure to adversity. And so, what I think is important to highlight at the end of this talk is that the most toxic or teratogenic risks may remain unaddressed in most programs and most policies unless we focus on things like decreasing kids' turbulence and exposure to failing systems. That it's not good when we go from great childcare to crappy kindergarten, or from great kindergarten to crappy third grade, that level of turbulence can't possibly be helping, given what I've now learned about turbulence in kids' executive function. Decreasing violence exposure, it sounds, sort of hopelessly naive to say, like, oh, we should study on violence. But really, I didn't get kids, the epidemiological reality of kids' exposures to violence until we started following our own sample. And then I started paying attention more to what we know about kids' exposure to violence more broadly. And I think if we think about poverty without thinking about that for this sample of kids, both inside the home and outside the home, we're missing a big chunk of the boat, if not the boat completely. Anti-poverty effort is obviously key, and it's why I started the talk with that figure, to emphasize that we could move kids out of poverty by actually substantially changing the transfers that we make to families with kids. And the Earned Income Tax Credit is the biggest anti-poverty effort that we have ever initiated nationally, and the most effective. We actually move more families out of poverty through the Earned Income Tax Credit than we do through any other lever. It's almost never discussed, and we know almost nothing about its impact on kids' developmental function. Like, honestly, I don't know of anything really empirically rigorous that shows us what its impact is on kids' development. And that's crazy to me. It's something we could easily do. Great. I need to talk to you about that and find out where it is. And then I think Renee and Duncan are doing a phenomenal job, and I'm glad that they're coming next semester, specifically to talk about multi-pronged effort. And I think what is so cool about their effort to make publicly accessible their work, and the book that Sean and others have contributed to, is that idea that it is going to take systemic intervention, and that's not a crazy notion. It is a doable notion, and is immediately and palpably accessible to a public if you learn how to communicate to a public about research more generally. So that idea that we are, as scientists, as social scientists, irrelevant to social change, I categorically reject. I think we are not trained, and we do not train each other in how to do that, but I think it is eminently doable to get with that. Whether we communicate to journalists or we communicate to producers and get videos made and post them on YouTube, or we find some other mechanism like writing books, we actually have a phenomenal opportunity, if not a responsibility, to get the word out that executive function is malleable in the context of intervention, that academic achievement is malleable, that poor kids are not consigned to failure in the context of income inequality. So with that, I'll stop.
Parenting teaching, which involves the parents talking to kids, which then correlates with the language development issues for ICS kids. So, in fact, you're doing more than one intervention. How do you sort them out?
Right, so that's a great question. How, when you are doing what's called a bundled intervention, do you sort out which of the many mechanisms that might be going might be yielding the benefit, should we find benefit? And the honest answer is we can't. We can only say, with this bundle, you get these changes. And if you want to get these changes, we suggest you don't stray from the bundle. And we can't tell you the cheaper version or the more easy version. Just do the whole kit and caboodle. And that Susan Landry has developed this model with low-income, native-born, Spanish-speaking Latina families in Texas, and it's worked great. She's found beautiful impacts on joint attention, language output, self-regulation for her RCTs in Texas with second and third generation native-born families. So who knows if it's going to work with our families in New York? Who knows if I can even get everybody to do it? But should I get everyone to do it? And should families stick with me and actually do the post-test? We hope to find evidence for this bundle having those effects, with the potentially the possibility of evidence of these biobehavioral mediators. I really want to know if mom's stress reactivity and kids' stress reactivity moves with the participation in some more reflective, calmer, positive engagement with their babies in that way that I just described. Other questions? You guys have been awesome. It's almost 7. I'm very grateful. You have an impressive audience. Thank you very much. Have a great evening.